Hello there, and welcome to Lesson 2. So, with this lesson, we're going to take and review the things we learned in Lesson 1 and build on those, adding new things, so that you can further hone and develop your skills as a reader, which will in turn help you hone and develop your skills as a writer to achieve our goal for the class of becoming as effective of a communicator as you can be in all different types of writing and rhetorical situations. You remember we're using Mortimer Adler's book called How to Read a Book as our method or our guide to help us learn these skills. And then Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot short stories as our object or our thing we'll practice these skills on. And so we're going to take a look at the next few chapters from Adler's How to Read a Book and another Hercule Poirot short story as we add the next layer here, build on these foundations, and further hone these skills. So here's an overview of what we'll cover in this lesson, and just like the first one is divided into 3 parts. So you don't have to watch it all at once. You can watch one part and then come back later on, whatever's most convenient for you. First, we'll go over the second level of reading. Remember, according to Adler's guidelines for how to be a demanding reader, when you read books and articles and other things, there's 4 levels of reading. And so last time we went over how to be a demanding reader in general and a little bit on the first level of reading called elementary reading. Today, this lesson is primarily focused on the second level of reading, which is inspectional reading. So in part 1, we'll talk about what inspectional reading is, how to do it, why it's important. Part 2, we're going to have a case study, so an example of inspectional reading. And inspectional reading in particular, that particular level of reading, is really useful for reading things like academic articles and books, the type of things you have to read in most college classes. So it should be a really useful skill for you to learn and practice in this lesson. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at a very professional article or essay on Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot writings. So we're adding kind of another layer this week where in addition to Adler's book, in addition to the detective short stories, we're looking at someone else's analysis of one of those detective stories. And so this will be really great because it'll help you hone your analytical skills for how to approach these stories by seeing an example of that kind of analysis I'm asking you to do. And finally, we'll take a look at another short story. This one's called The Dream. And so we'll review what we learned last time and see how the things we're learning today from both how to read a book and the article can be applied to our study of this story to, like I said, build on those foundations and learn new things that will continue to help us grow as readers and writers. So, inspectional reading. What is that? Why do we do it? How do we do it? Why do we do it? And where does it fit into the overall framework here of being a demanding reader? Real quick to review from last time, the 4 levels of reading. So there's elementary reading, then inspectional reading, analytical reading, and finally syntopical reading. Elementary reading we didn't really discuss in detail in the lecture last time. This is the easiest to understand of the 4 levels. So last time we really talked about demanding reading in general. This lesson's the first time we'll really get into the specifics and nuances of a particular level. The reason for that is elementary reading is, as it sounds, the most basic level of reading. And so it's essentially, you could say, literacy. If you know how to read in general to understand the words on the page, then you can do elementary reading. And this is important because the premise of Adler's book, and it's important because it's the premise I'm adopting for our class, is that once you reach literacy or elementary reading, you can read, but you're not being always as demanding of a reader as you could be. And if you become a demanding reader and move on to levels 2 through 4, then you can really grow as a thinker and as an individual. So today we'll look at level 2, inspectional reading, which is before you actually sit down and read the text, doing what we call some pre-reading or previewing the text kinds of things to get a basic understanding of the book or the article before you even read it. In lessons 3 and 4, we'll go over analytical reading, and then after midterm, the second half of the quarter, we'll go over some topical reading. So elementary reading is just literacy, the ability to read. Inspectional reading is previewing the text before you get into it. Analytical reading is reading it deeply, reading it critically, being that demanding reader. That's really the meat of how to read a book. That's where we'll spend the most time. And some topical reading is putting two things or more together, seeing the connections between different books. So these images, illustrate how, elementary reading is like the blank slate, inspectional reading, the circles filled in. So you're going a little bit deeper. Analytical reading, you have all the lines in there so you can see the details. And then some topical reading is the overlapping of the two. So with this review and background in mind, let's take a look specifically at inspectional reading. And Adler has a series of tips for how to do inspectional reading. So when you get a book, look at the title page and preface. You can tell a lot from the title of a book. Study the table of contents. This will give you kind of an outline for the structure of the book. Check the index. So important terms might be in the back of the book. That can kind of give you a clue of some things that are important and where to find them in the book. Read the publisher's blurb. So usually there's some kind of writing on the front or the back of the book that kind of gives the book praise or a little summary. So, reading a summary is a good thing. Look at the chapters that seem to be pivotal to its argument. So from the title, you can kind of figure out what the book is about. And then from looking at the table of contents, you can see all the chapters. So comparing the title of the chapters, you can highlight which chapters are the most important, identify those. And that's really helpful. Like I said, inspectional reading will really be helpful to you as you're a university student, because sometimes you're asked to read really long, dense academic things. And I don't think you necessarily always have to read every word of those. So to get the gist of them or what's most important, what you need to know to do well in classes and apply to your life, you can get by using some of these strategies. Which chapters are the most important? Maybe you only need to read those chapters in their entirety, and you can kind of, skim the other ones. It's a possibility, at least. Turn the pages, dipping in here and there, reading a paragraph or two, sometimes several pages in sequence, never more than that. This is really good. Again, reading an academic book or article for school is obviously important, but it's not quite the same as reading a novel. Reading a novel, you can't really skip parts of it or you might miss something. But reading an academic book for school, you might not have to read every word of it. This is what I said a minute ago, so I'm kind of reiterating that point. But, flip through it, dip in here and there. I love the way Adler says that, and read a paragraph or two. If you look at chapters, the most important chapters and their subsections or little sections will be marked off by a subtitle. Read the first few pages or first few paragraphs of each chapter or each section, at least of the most important chapters. You don't have to read every single word, and you will really get what the author is communicating, at least in an academic or what Adler calls an expository book. And so a lot of the reading strategies we'll get when we get into the other levels of reading will be helpful for reading all kinds of works, including fiction. These strategies are particularly helpful with the academic kind of stuff you have to read in school. And in part 2 of the lecture, I'm going to demonstrate that when I take us through the article on Agatha Christie. All right, so those tips from Adler are really helpful, but they really apply to books, right? He was talking about a title page, a table of contents, an index. Oftentimes for classes in college, you're not asked to read whole books. Oftentimes you are, but not always. Like in here, we're reading most of how to read a book, but not all of it. And I'm going to assign a lot of articles for you from Canvas that'll be on Canvas throughout the quarter. So how could we kind of take these tips from Adler and adapt them to reading? Same basic principles, same spirit of the idea of inspectional reading, but some tips kind of modified specifically to doing inspectional reading with articles rather than whole books. And so I've modified Adler's tips here. If you take note of these, save or pause this lecture, take a screenshot, jot down some notes, whatever works best for you. I really think if you carry these tips with you to other classes, they will help you survive all the reading you have to do in college. And like I said, in part 2 of this lecture, I'll go specifically into those tips, using them as I read and analyze for you the article on Agatha Christie. So here we go. Think carefully about the title and look up words you don't know. So just like with a book, the title of an article, just from the title, can tell you a lot about it. Sometimes the title even contains the main thesis or argument. A lot of the things you'll read in college, though, will have really technical terms specific to that field. And so you might not know the meaning of every word in the title. So analyze the title before you even read the text and look up words you don't know from the title. Read the first few paragraphs or pages. What is the main argument? So again, with academic articles, just like academic books, you don't have to read the book in its entirety. But if it's a good article, its argument or thesis will be really clear, ideally by the end of the first page or even first paragraph. Sometimes in longer articles, it can take 2 or 3 pages to get there. But most academic articles have those subtitles, those bulleted sections. And so if you read just the first section, by the end of that, you should get the thesis or the argument. So being able to identify in your own words what viewpoint the author is trying to persuade you to agree with, that'll give you a really good idea of what the article is about. Sometimes that's all you need to read. It depends on, what you're using the article for. So after you've kind of identified what this article is about, go on, and you don't need to read it in its entirety, but read the title of each subsection. Again, those bulleted names. It's usually divided up in 3, 4, or more subsections. So what do each of those titles say? And just like the title for the whole article or book, those subsection titles can give you a clue as to what each section is about. So you don't have to read each section in its entirety. And you can also see the structure of the argument. If these are the points the author is making, why are they making them in this order? How do these points build up the argument in a logical way so that the author is really supporting their thesis? And so just like you can get the thesis or the argument of the article from the title sometimes, you can get the argument or the subpoint for each subsection from its title, and you can then look at how the argument is laid out to see its structure, organization, flow, etc. Read the first few paragraphs of each subsection, make notes in the margins. So again, you don't necessarily have to read each section in its entirety, but just like with a book, you might read the first few paragraphs or first few pages of each chapter. Here, read at least the start of each subsection so you get the gist of what it's about. You don't need to read every single point of evidence, but you need to know what each section is about. Sometimes you can get that from the title, oftentimes you can, but it's good to kind of confirm that by reading the first paragraph or 2 or 3 of each section until you're like, okay, this is what this section is about. Then you can move on. And as you read, anytime you read, you should be taking notes in the margins. So like I said last time, keep that pen or pencil or keypad. If you're on a computer or smartphone or tablet reading, keep whatever you're using busy. Keep that pen or keypad busy so that you're making notes, because if you write something down while you're reading, you'll remember it better. Next, make a list of key terms and look up their definitions. So again, academic writing often uses specialized language. You might not know the meaning of every word, so as you go, highlight which words repeat and seem important. Make a list of those, and from those, identify which ones you don't necessarily know what they mean, and look up those definitions so that you have a list of key terms and you know the meaning of each key term. And sometimes the English language is very fluid, so sometimes you'll have words that mean something in one context, but in this particular academic discipline mean something different. So when you identify the key terms, you want to make sure you really know what those words mean. Finally, check the bibliography. So you can look at the bibliography and see where this author got their information. And depending on, again, it depends on what you're using it for. If you need to know this book or article to pass an exam, the bibliography might not be that important. But if you need to use it for research, say you're writing a research paper like you will at the end of this course, and say it's a really helpful article, like it's really helpful, it's like the best article from your research, then probably a lot of the sources that person uses could also be helpful to you if it's so closely related to your own topic. So you can kind of pilfer their bibliography, if you will, for more sources to make your research process much easier. So again, these are inspectional reading tips. By inspectional reading, we mean inspecting the text before you read it in its entirety. And if you use these tips for academic writing, you can perhaps not even have to read the text in its entirety, depending on what your purpose for it is. So that was the inspectional reading portion of how to read a book. My overview of it. And we're almost done with part 1 of how to read a book. And part 2 is devoted entirely to analytical reading, or the third level of reading, which, like I said, is the most important one. And that's what we'll start reading in next week's lesson. But before Adler gets to part 2, he ends part 1 with chapter 5. We've already talked about how to be a demanding reader, but before getting into analytical reading, which is where you really become a demanding reader, Adler does kind of a little segue by having a little chapter on some specific tips for how to be a demanding reader. And so they're really important. So I want to go over those with you now, and that's why they're kind of, wedged in here during the inspectional reading lecture. And there's two main things I'm going to go over from chapter 5 on specifics of being a demanding reader. One is 4 basic questions a demanding reader asks. This is really important. I think asking these questions of anything you read should be something you do. If you go back to our analysis of that Cam Newton Gatorade commercial, asking these questions of something like that can help you decide if you should buy Gatorade or not. And I know you may not do that for everything you read or see, but if you do, you'll get more out of it and you'll make more informed decisions. So these are the most fundamental questions for reading or analyzing any piece of media. What is the book about as a whole? So what is the main point the author is trying to make? Or if it's literature, fiction, like Hercule Poirot, what is the central theme of the work? So what is the thesis statement, basically? 2, what is being said in detail and how? So once you know the thesis, what are like the supporting points? You don't need to read something in its entirety, but you want to know how the author makes their argument. That's important. Is the book true in whole or part? So this is a harder, kind of trickier question. On one level, it's, do you think the author has effectively supported their argument? Why or why not? Which is a question we talked about last time in the previous lecture. I asked at the end, do you think Hercule Poirot's theory he presents for proving the murder, do you think that is, do you think he's right? Do you think he's effectively proven his argument? But this goes to like a deeper level too, because the author may really support their argument well, may really have some good points, but you still might not agree with them, even though you think they did a good job. And that's completely fine. But how does that relate to the question of, is the book or article true? So one thing you have to consider is, what are your beliefs, values, morals that inform your opinion, and what are the beliefs, values, morals that inform the author's opinion? And those may be very different. And later in part 3, which we'll go over in the next couple lessons after this lesson, Adler gets into coming to terms with the author. So you and the author kind of have to be on the same page to judge the book fairly. And so these are the 4 most important questions, but in the next 2 lessons after this lesson, we'll go into them in more detail. This is kind of an overview he gives before getting to that more in-depth section of the book that covers these in detail. Finally, the 4th one, what of it? So does it offer something of significance or value? When you're done reading something, even if you know what it means, even if you agree with it, was it worth reading? Does it teach us something that matters? So kind of the last question you could say is the most important one, and the last question is, why does this matter, what I just read? All right, so finally, we have the last point, the second point from chapter 5, which is how to make a book your own. And again, these are just some strategies for as you read. So once you're really into it, you've passed the level of inspectional reading, you're really committed to actually sitting down and reading this. What do you do as you read to own that book, to make it your own? Underline the major points. Put vertical lines in the margins. Sometimes it's multiple lines form the point. So then you'd want to have a line down the side to show which lines of text encompass that major point. A star, asterisk, or other doodad at the margin. So you're going to highlight a lot of major points while you're reading. Which ones are the most important? You want to use some symbol to identify those. Most people use the star asterisk, but you can use whatever symbol or doodad you want, as long as you're identifying these points are the most important ones. Numbers in the margin. So when an author makes an argument or presents a theme, there's usually a logical sequence of the points they use to make that argument. And so putting numbers can help show you the author's thought process, which is really helpful to remembering and understanding the argument later on. Numbers of other pages in the margins. So a book or an article will often, as the argument builds, like I just said, it kind of reference or allude to other parts. So you can put a note like page 5 references an idea from page 2 to support the argument there. Circling of keywords or phrases, like I said earlier, you want to really identify those keywords. So because they're principal to the argument the author's making. Finally, and this one's really important, writing in the margin or the top or bottom of the page. And listen to this quote from Adler, why we do this. Listen to how he says this. To reduce a complicated discussion to a simple statement. So most of the things we read, especially in college, are said in a fairly complicated way. This isn't always the author trying to be obtuse. Sometimes there's just so much going on, the idea is so complex. But if you can restate that idea in your own words, that shows that you've truly understood it. So when you're done reading something, a paragraph, a section, a page, a chapter, whatever seems to be, this is a whole unit or section, paraphrase in your own words, just 1, 2, 3 sentences, what it was about. And if you can do that as you go through something you're reading, you will understand what you're reading so well. So again, these are tips on how to really make a book your own. I want to give you an example of this before we move on. So here's a page from the Hercule Poirot story we're going to analyze at the end of this lesson, and it's The Dream is the name of the story. And this page has what I would argue is, you'll see in part 3 of this lesson, is the most important chapter in the story. And so I've done a few of the things here that we just outlined from Adler in terms of tips for owning a book. So writing in the margin, you can see at that first long paragraph there, at the end of it I've written that Mr. Farley is cheap but willing to pay Poirot. So he doesn't want to be swindled, he says, but he'll pay top dollar for the best. So a man like Poirot is worth his money because Poirot is the greatest detective in the world. So I've taken that, paragraph, which looks like it's about 6 lines long, and I've paraphrased it in my own words. So I've reduced that paragraph to 6 lines to 5 words. And I can remember that. It's bookmarked in my brain now, because understanding Benedict Farley's character is crucial to understanding the story. I've got, clear insight about his character, paraphrased here from 6 lines to 5 words, fewer words than lines. That's what Adler is talking about with that last point. A couple more examples. Underlining. You can see the statement I have underlined says he had conformed to the popular idea of himself. So this is a man who is a famous eccentric millionaire. So before Poirot meets him, he has a reputation. Poirot is seeing here that the man he meets, when he actually meets him in person, measures up so closely to his reputation. Most people, famous people, you hear about them, you meet them, it might not be quite exactly the same as what you've heard, but this man, Benedict Farley, is everything Poirot has heard about him. So his actual person, when Poirot meets him, his actual personality matches almost too close, you could say, to his reputation, which might make us wonder, might make us be skeptical. And so that's really important. Anything that makes us skeptical when we're reading a mystery. So that's why I underlined it, and I want to remember that as I continue to read. Finally, we have a paragraph with the vertical lines. Remember, on the last slide, I distinguished between underlining horizontally and vertically. If it all fits on one line, go horizontal, but if it's a whole paragraph or multiple lines, go vertical. And like I said, that paragraph, I think, is the most important paragraph in the whole story, which we'll talk about why at the end of lesson 3. So here's some tips for as you read to be a demanding reader, kind of build on what we already talked about with inspectional reading. We're now going to take these strategies, particularly the inspectional reading ones, and apply them to a very professional article, which is on, of course, Agatha Christie.